You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of June, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Did the Ukraine Peace Summit achieve any small measure of peace? What responsibility do European governments have towards migrants crossing the Mediterranean? And can younger Chinese pandas make a dent in Australian diplomacy? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests, Aliona Hlifko and Jacob Parakilas, will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author John Elledge about his new book, A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. Stay tuned, all that coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Aliona Hlifko, former regional Ukrainian MP and managing director of the Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy think tank. And I'm also joined by Jacob Parakilas, research leader for RAND Europe's Defence and Security Research Group. Hello to you both.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, one thing we discovered before coming on this show, to start with our introductory banter, as it's always called, is that you were both in Paris, but not for the actual important reasons that everyone else was in Paris or France this week. Jacob, you were in Normandy.
I was in Normandy, and when I came back to the office, I nearly started a war because it turns out I have some colleagues from Normandy and I have some colleagues from Brittany. And there's a very strong disagreement about which of those regions is the better one. And I make no judgment, but I did have a nice time.
But you've only been to one of them.
I had a nice time in Normandy. Okay. I'm going to avoid provoking any further diplomatic incidents. I had a nice time in Normandy.
Can you kind of push this by maybe sort of pushing for maybe a free trip to Brittany?
Well, I mean, I would accept a free trip to Brittany. I mean, obviously within the bounds of all normal ethical arrangements and so on, but I'm willing to be convinced.
And Aliona, you were in Paris for the moment where all of France went crazy, but also not for the reason of the French elections.
I was indeed. It turns out that President Zelensky and I were in Paris at the same time. But yes, you're right. I wasn't there to see any of the important people. I was just there to celebrate the most important date in my life, my birthday.
Your birthday. Well, very nice. What did you do for your birthday? What did you find in Paris to do?
It was my first time in Paris, and I was taking on a surprise trip by my partner. So that was really lovely and romantic. So we did a whole round of museums, something very touristy that all people do, and just had a lot of French wine. You can't do any worse for a birthday, I'm going to say that. Well, speaking of the person you did not see while you were there, President Zelensky, we will start this show with Ukraine, which over the weekend wrapped up its first ever peace summit in Switzerland, a summit that, as is painfully obvious to everyone, was happening in a time of war and no small amount of divided loyalties. The result was something of a mixed blessing. Russia and China did not participate, but some 90 countries did. South Africa, India, Saudi Arabia were among the 10 nations that did not sign a final communique respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity, but some 80 countries did, including, maybe most notably, Turkey. Aliona, this whole summit was arguably partially like an expectations game, or I felt like that's what it became as we were leading into it. Did the summit, in your mind, kind of surpass the expectations of what it could do? I think in Ukraine, it definitely matched the expectations and the effort that was put into the summit. First of all, it's important to understand that there was no objective or no goal to set the peace right there and then in Switzerland at this summit. The main objective was to set a precedent and create a framework where in all the future wars, not just the war in Ukraine, the countries can come together and they have the clear set of rules and a strategy on how to reach peace to abide by the UN Charter. The UN Charter that has been violated with the Ukraine war and Russia's attack on it for the first time since the Second World War. So there clearly needs to be a whole new mechanism because we've seen so many international organizations being helpless in trying to regulate the war. So this is meant to have a long-term effect. And there were many arguments that how can you achieve peace if Russia, the aggressor, one of the sides to the war is not at the table. Well, that was not an objective at this concrete meeting. We've had 2 meetings before, the initial one in Copenhagen, the second one in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. Now it was the highest level meeting to date with leaders of states and highest representatives of states. And the next one, I think, is planned in Canada, hopefully by the end of this year. So it's a long-term process, but I would say that it's definitely setting the framework not just for reaching peace in Ukraine in this specific war, but also for all the future wars in the 21st century.
It was an interesting approach, Jacob, when Aliona speaks about it there, this idea of making it not just about Ukraine, but on this focus particularly on territorial sovereignty, on integrity, something that you would imagine many countries would want to sign up for. There aren't that many countries in the world that have an interest in their territorial borders being violated. How do you feel that worked?
I mean, I think it's definitely an important precedent to set, and it sets it apart from the Russian sort of peace plan in inverted commas, which is basically give us the territory that we've taken by force and also some territory that we have not yet managed to take by force, and also declaim any objective of joining the EU or NATO. Basically give us 90% of what we wanted at the beginning of this war and we will stop invading your country. And I think the distance between what Ukraine has set out as its sort of stated objectives and this emphasis on territorial integrity and what Putin is saying as his lines for negotiation demonstrates why there isn't a more meaningful direct negotiation between them. There's just no common territory yet. But I think the question of getting countries to agree to some kind of binding statement on territorial integrity, and of course international law is already quite clear on territorial integrity, but then you have any number of instances where you have a disputed border of varying provenance, Nagorno-Karabakh, you have Kashmir, you have any number of cases where two countries have not yet agreed on a settled status of a particular piece of territory. And I think the danger in trying to link a fairly clear-cut example like Ukraine, where there were internationally recognized borders and they were violated by another sovereign state, versus an instance where perhaps two countries have disagreed since their founding or since the inception of the current state of international law, creates some really difficult perceptual issues and some difficult alliance management issues, because those states are going to see these questions not in the same black and white terms that perhaps a state with long settled borders might.
I mean, Aliona, do you get the sense, even if this was about creating this sort of broader framework, do you imagine that when it comes to President Zelensky, he was also hoping to some degree, change minds with this, or at least maybe keep up the international support? I mean, we have found this generally and we've spoken before on this show about Zelensky sort of trying, for basically 2.5 years to say the same thing in different ways in order to keep the interest alive, in order to keep countries on side. Do you imagine that this was what he was trying to do with a summit like this as well?
I think so, definitely. And from speaking to various experts in Ukraine itself, they were saying that it almost turned into a collective effort of conversation with the global south. So-called global south, the countries who align with Russia, the countries who don't align with anyone, is the new non-alliance states that are forming right now, the whole conversation about multilateralism. So there were certainly attempts that to reach the countries that are normally not on the West side. So it was an attempt to talk to them directly and talk about issues that could be relatable to every single one of them. Not so much about territorial conflicts like Jacob mentioned, but just UN Charter and violating those rules like genocidal war crimes, abducting children, returning of the hostages. So on a human level to let them know and help them see the extent to which Ukrainian people are suffering. And of course, it was quite disappointing to see the highest leadership of the most important country at the summit, the United States, not being there, and some of the disagreements that were happening before the summit of President Biden not attending such an important event. But yes, I think it's still all part of the effort to keep the attention and interest to Ukraine ongoing.
What did you make, Jacob, of that conversation with the global south, I wonder? And also just this idea that, on the one hand, as you say, part of the debate here was this question of territorial integrity, and some countries who maybe have their own disputes were uncomfortable. But then there is also this general idea of, like, should we remain neutral in a conflict like this, even when the battle lines drawn are pretty clear? We're still saying, whether it's India, South Africa, those countries that say we still don't want to get involved. Is that still doable today?
I mean, I think the problem is that the offer that the West, either collectively or individually, can make to the global south is very different than the offer that Russia, China, I don't think that there is a formed sort of axis in the way that some people have sort of analogized this situation to, e.g. 1937. But there is clearly a kind of allegiance of interests between Russia, China, Iran, a few other sort of countries there. And they can make kinds of offers to certain countries in the global south, like the Wagner Group, or now Africa Corps, offer of a regime stability package. For example, we will send mercenaries, we will ensure that your regime, give us rights to a few of your gold mines, and we will give you bodyguards, we will insulate you from the consequences of your own action, we will secure your leadership. It's not something that the US or Britain or France does for leadership. And when you are the supreme leader of a country and you get to decide, this is how we vote at the UN, this is what my country's interests are going to be. And frankly, when that's been sort of reinforced by seeing the way the West has been a fickle ally, the way the West sort of has used development funds and debts, the West is not, is not a perfect avatar of national interest for much of the global south. I mean, certainly it tries in certain respects, and it has some real successes to point to, but there's a very, very complicated and not necessarily great history there. And to suddenly say, hey, we need you on side for this one, isn't necessarily a particularly compelling pitch. And it's not, and it couldn't be, right? There's a whole history that you can't unseparate there.
Well, let's move on to another difficult issue in Europe. For many years now, one of the questions surrounding immigration policy on the continent has been just what kind of responsibility governments have towards those who make the treacherous journey across the Mediterranean. It is a trip that kills scores of migrants every year in capsized boats and dinghies, but this week the BBC has alleged that some of these deaths may have been caused by the Greek Coast Guard. A BBC investigation alleges that Coast Guard caused the death of dozens of migrants over the past 3 years by not aiding or even actively forcing migrants to retreat outside of Greek territorial waters, in some cases, according to witnesses, even throwing migrants back into the water deliberately. Aliona, this is an incredibly sad account when you read this BBC investigation, what some of the migrants themselves say. What did you make of these very brutal accounts? I mean, at the same time, did it surprise you that this kind of thing is going on?
It's a deeply troubling situation and a growing one. Unfortunately, not surprising given how many deaths we've witnessed in the English Channel and crossings from France to the UK of asylum seekers. This is a problem that keeps growing in Europe. And I think one positive thing that did come out of this investigation, or hopefully will, that the government will actually stop paying attention, not just the Greek government, but the EU institutions as well, that yes, the policies need to be robust, the orders given to the guard services are as effective as they are, but human lives are still more valuable and precious than any policies that could be in place. Migration crisis in Europe is an ongoing problem, and it's the one that still requires quite a lot of attention and serious approach. Yes, they did have the recent pact on migration and asylum seekers that was adopted in April, May. But again, everything will come down to a unity amongst member states, not just on burden sharing, not just on all countries accepting the asylum seekers and versus the ones that are on the immediate front line, like Greece and Italy and now the UK, but also on finances and integrating the immigrants and asylum seekers into societies. It needs to be a holistic approach. And again, when it comes to security, we need to look deeper and much closer, even into Africa and Wagnerites dealings in Africa, because they have learned very skillfully to weaponize migration against Europe as well.
Jacob, this investigation, I suppose one of the sad aspects of this as well was that it exposes what happens, but that doesn't mean, it's in the public eye because we have these direct accounts of what, say, the Greek Coast Guard is doing. That does not, or that's separate from many of these deaths that happen with nobody there because a dinghy or a boat capsizes and there is nobody there to save them whatsoever. And those are the things that kind of go unreported in this. What do you make of, I guess, how this might change the debate about what governments should do about all of these migrants who are making this kind of journey?
I mean, I think what it should do and what it will do are two quite different things. What it should do, obviously, I mean, as Aliona said, is to reinforce the orders given and ensure there's accountability and make sure that the protection of human rights and human life remains paramount, regardless of what broader immigration policies are. The idea that people might be intentionally left at sea. I mean, it's a violation of international law. That's unambiguous. And in fact, part of the BBC investigation was they caught the special operations commander for the Greek Coast Guard saying that down the phone in a hot mic moment. Literally, this is an international crime. Why did they do it in broad daylight? And what will happen now, I mean, I think unfortunately, this has become something which there have been enough maritime tragedies involving migrants, and it hasn't fundamentally shifted the debate. The human rights organizations make the noise that they can make, and they point to it, and they rightfully say, this is horrible. More needs to be done, and then more just kind of isn't done. I think there's a degree to which some level of suffering, some level of violence, either implicit or explicit, against migrants has just become sort of normalized as part of the European migration policy. And so I'm not sure much will change.
Well, Aliona, in terms of things that are trying to be done, ways that this is being changed, the one, I guess, particularly controversial way that we constantly talk about are these deals that European countries are making with other countries, whether it's here in the UK, the attempted Rwanda deal, or Italy trying to make a deal with Algeria, for example, as well. These are very controversial the way they're talked about, but there is also, I just wonder if there's an argument here in the sense that you have to balance this idea of, on the one hand, saving people in the Mediterranean in these boats, but also discouraging them from making a dangerous trip like that in the first place. Is there something we need to do on that front? And that's sort of what these kinds of plans are about. Stop them from trying a trip like this and finding other means for them to come instead.
Well, that's what I meant when I talked about holistic approach and going upstream. So basically, it's going to African countries, other countries, Middle East, the countries that are troubled by either complete poverty or famine and hunger or wars, and trying to resolve issues there. Because whether we like it or not, international organizations where the Western countries are at the forefront of those, they do have representation in all of those countries. And if we're talking about Russia weaponizing migration in Africa or taking and flying out migrants from Syria to Belarus to attack the Polish border, that can be solved by confronting Russia. If we are limiting international aid to African countries like Kenya, for example, then of course we shouldn't be surprised that then so many impoverished migrants try to seek better life in Europe or other countries that are much better off. If Syria gets completely destroyed again by Russia, then we shouldn't be surprised that 5 million Syrian refugees will try to make their way up to Europe, because those peoples only have one life. And as Jacob said, human life needs to be paramount to all other issues. And until we understand that and made actual changes and steps to prioritize human life on all continents, the problem will not be solved.
Just finally on this, Jacob, when you talked about whether, what should versus what will happen, do you worry or do you wonder about the far-right gains that we've seen in the last week in Europe, and to what extent that either means that people sort of care less about this, or we've sort of reached a limit of caring on this that really complicates the issue for governments as well?
I mean, I'm going to take myself out of the game of election prognostication here, because that never goes well. But I do think, I mean, there is, and Aliona's right. There's a kind of upstream issue. If you don't want migrants trying to come into Europe en masse, you need to create economic opportunities and stability and a basic level of sustenance for people. So, I mean, imagine what it would take to convince you to bring your children on a dinghy and try to cross the Aegean Sea or the English Channel in search of a better life. Imagine how bad things must be on the near side of that journey for you to take your children into your hands and think that that's the best chance for them. But at the same time as saying we need to raise a wall, a lot of the policies that come out of government's decisions to say we're not going to let any of these people in is also we're going to spend our money at home. And that, that's a heads I win, tails you lose type scenario. There's no attempt even. And, and I don't think that foreign aid is necessarily a sort of guaranteed silver bullet that if you spend enough money on famine reduction, you can prevent or slow significantly or stop illegal migration. But you're basically just saying we're not going to let you in, and we're not going to do anything to create opportunities that might keep you where you are. And that just seems like a problem that a way to approach a problem that isn't going to solve it.
Well, speaking of the far right in Europe, the European Football Championships are underway this week, and amid the excitement of goals and screaming fans in stadiums, there was also a bit of politics as the French star Kylian Mbappe used the occasion to call on his country's youth to vote in France's upcoming election and counter the rise of extremists. No doubt many were pleased by his intervention, while others may have been disappointed, some on the right by the comments themselves and others by the mere distraction from their pleasurable viewing of a sporting event, their one distraction from daily political life. Jacob, were we surprised by Mbappe's remarks? It is not the first time a sports person has spoken out about politics, but it is rarer than other professions.
Yeah, these are people who are generally thrust into the limelight, the extremely, extremely strong limelight at a very, very young age, more so than musicians or film stars who might become a public figure after 15 or 20 or 30 years of grinding away in relative obscurity. Sports stars tend to become megastars in their late teens or early 20s at the latest. They tend to, at that sort of peak of political activation, and the when you're speaking from the commanding heights of middle age here, the bright-eyed optimism about the ways in which the world could be a better place. So it's not hugely surprising that sports stars use this enormous megaphone, this enormous degree of public interest in them to speak out on issues that mean something to them.
Well, Aliona, I think the way Kylian Mbappe spoke, though, was also very impressive. I think just he showed a sort of wisdom beyond his years, maybe, to Jacob's point there. And I did wonder for you, sort of watching particularly Ukrainian sports stars, how that has moved you over the last few years. They've had to also grow up extremely quickly and really put themselves in this conversation in a way that typically sports people don't have to do.
The latest video I've seen with Ukrainian athletes, football players specifically, who are all members of foreign football clubs here in Europe, they recorded a short video, each of them saying which city in Ukraine they're from. And most of those cities were now destroyed or under attack. So that, I think, was one of those most heartbreaking videos that came out of this war. But it just gives you a perspective. And the way Mbappe talked about political situation in France, or just generally urging young people, the generation who looks up to him for all the right reasons, and he serves as an inspiration to them, just to go out and participate and to use the right that so many generations before them fought for, and so many people in other countries across the world still fight for. I would only support that, because political participation is key to successful democracy. And whatever choice you make, you need to go out and avoid any sort of political annihilation and just make your voice heard.
It was interesting, wasn't it, Jacob, that focus on the young specifically? Is that something that you imagine too is needed? There is a sort of, well, mix right now, I guess, an apathy among the young, but also a tendency towards the extremes.
I mean, I think there's also a post-COVID thing, and maybe we don't talk about it very much, but I mean, COVID was a particular experience for the young. It disrupted education. It disrupted the time when you're supposed to be sort of out, discovering the world, and suddenly you're told, oh no, you just sit inside and do your studies over Zoom, and you can socialize in a World of Warcraft chat room or whatever. I realize that's a massively out-of-date video game reference, but
we'll take it.
Roll with me here. As previously mentioned, I am old. But
I got the reference, I'm afraid to say.
But I think there is something about a young person suddenly thrust into the limelight, who can then, and Kylian Mbappe or any other 24-year-old mega millionaire sports superstar is not necessarily representative of or an avatar of young people, but they have a young person's experience. They have a sort of, their shaping of life was their life was shaped by the events in the order that it was for other young people. So I think, especially in this kind of post-COVID malaise, having somebody speak up very sort of clearly and forthrightly about a political issue is activating in some degree. It's important to some degree in a way that an old fart like me wouldn't be.
Aliona, just a final word on this. I do wonder on, I guess, the flip side of it a little bit when you also think of, say, Ukrainian sports stars. Is there a toll that this takes? Because it is also, when you are forced into this kind of limelight and expected to speak out, and over many years, frankly, does that distraction from what you're actually, wanting to do, does that take a toll, do we imagine, too?
Absolutely. Just imagine how that affects your performance. Stress, anxiety, sleepless nights, constant worrying about your loved ones when your home country all of a sudden, being in the middle of Europe in the 21st century, find itself at a war that looks like it goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. It's a brutal reality. I found myself struggling, even though I don't need to reach any high-level performance physically. I don't need to be constantly fit, but just being mentally fit and psychologically sane in these circumstances is very, very difficult. So I can only imagine how difficult it is for them to still fulfill all of their contracts, reach success, smile to the fans, send important social messages that they're responsible for, and go through war back home. But I think, just to echo what Jacob said, it's very important for young people to have a role model these days, especially with disruption of COVID that basically turned their lives upside down. If we remember our university young years, those were the formative years, and our COVID generation have kind of missed that. And maybe that's why we're seeing such a rise in violence and extremism amongst young people, especially in the US, is just because maybe they've missed that important part of participating in social life. So hopefully, and maybe that's the way out of it.
Well, finally for our panel, we do head to Australia, where the Prime Ministers of Australia and China have been making amends over the last couple of days. The rare visit included the serious conversations about avoiding military confrontations, but it also included the softest of soft power. China's Prime Minister Li, in a visit to the Adelaide Zoo, promised to replace 2 aging pandas on the brink of retirement with 2, quote, equally beautiful, lively, cute and younger pandas for the Australian public to enjoy for many years to come. Cue the... Aliona, scale of... I suggested that. I now totally distracted myself. Aliona, scale of 1 to 10, how important was this for the thawing of relations? The panda, not the military stuff.
A diplomatic breakthrough. Although I was sitting here and wondering, is that considered ageism towards pandas, that the old ones are getting replaced by the new ones?
I was struck by that exact thought as well. And not to make this political, but I was wondering, Jacob,
Pandas
how...
can be cute too. Come on.
Right?
Hashtag free the pandas.
Free the pandas. And, we have a U.S. presidential race going on where, there are some slightly...
you
so
had
I
to go
wonder
there.
where
You had
this
to
would
go there.
work. I know. I couldn't resist throwing something in.
I'm sorry. I love the idea of retired pandas. Do they do panda crosswords? Do they play panda golf? What does a retired panda do that a non-retired working age panda doesn't do? What's the dividing line here?
This is an important question, actually. I guess this does actually come down to retirement when we think about it. What do we want to do and be in retirement? I mean, do we imagine these pandas, Aliona, can just relax, or do they miss the role that they were playing in world diplomacy?
Well, I fear that I don't know how relaxed they can be in China during their retirement these days, because no one actually feels relaxed there these days. So I don't know. But going back to what you said about US elections, maybe that is Chinese way to actually hint at something much bigger, because obviously Australia has been the biggest ally of the US and UK in the recent AUKUS deal. It is certainly on the side of democracy, always talking about threats coming from Chinese state. So I don't know. Poor pandas just got caught in the international scandal.
Well, they absolutely do, which did make me wonder, Jacob, why China sort of does this. I mean, is this part of their effort now? They want to be seen as a misunderstood, bumbling country that is fundamentally cuddly.
No, I mean, I think pandas are the essence of soft power. They're furry. They are inherently unthreatening looking, and they just sit around eating bamboo. And so it's like a national strategic cuteness reserve that China can deploy. It's a very sort of specific, focused... I'm not using soft power correctly, but I'm going to use it anyways because it's a funny pun.
They are completely unthreatening. Isn't that a nice thing to hear?
Exactly right.
After
Unless
all
you're bamboo. In which case, watch out.
After all the topics we've been discussing here, it's nice to end on a cuddly, non-threatening note. Aliona Hlivko and Jacob Parakilas, thank you very much for joining us. And finally, on today's Daily, while we've spent a decent amount of this show talking about conflicts and borders, the reality is that they're pretty arbitrary. A line on a map dividing a chunk of land into people who obey two different sets of laws and spend two different currencies, regardless of how similar they might be otherwise, North and South Korea being among these screamingly obvious examples. The author John Elledge has been giving this whole thing more thought than the average person. His new book is called A History of the World in 47 Borders, the stories behind the lines on our maps. Monocle's Andrew Muller spoke to John at Midori House earlier. Andrew began by asking John just how hard it was to narrow the number of borders he deals with in the book to just 47.
Oh, it wasn't that hard at all, because what I did was I just kept writing until I ran out of space and time. The number wasn't set in advance. It was like, to some extent, it was a matter of I wrote the ones I was interested in, and I wrote a bunch that I thought were important, and then I saw what was missing. But there's no reason it couldn't have been longer or come to that shorter if it had to be.
There wasn't an unlucky 48th that just failed to make the cut.
Well, I shouldn't say this, though. We're at 1.50.
Ooh.
And we cut a couple of chapters because I was over the word count, and also because there's lingering effects of BuzzFeed and so on. You never want a round number, do you? So
there's a lot of questions about borders. There's the historical, there's the political, and there are the more metaphysical ones, which struck me as interesting, possibly because I come from a country which does get a mention in the book, but which is a continent which has no national borders, i.e. Australia. So it's always been the case for me when I've travelled in Europe or Africa or actually basically anywhere else, the idea that you can just be standing in one place and thinking, if I just walk over there, everything will be different. It's especially weird when you cross the border by foot. And you confront that question quite early on about whether it's the identities that create the borders or the borders that create the identities. Which did you come down on, well, to use a border-style analogy, either side of that?
I think it's completely unresolvable. It is like one of the book's big themes is the formation of identities, especially national identities. I mean, if I'm honest, one of the reasons I kind of became obsessed with this stuff in the first place is because I grew up right on the very edge of Greater London, in a place that nobody thinks of as London, even though it has been officially for more than 50 years. And it was very important to me as a slightly bookish, nerdy kid that I came from London, not Essex. So I think that's where my obsession comes from. It's not a national identity thing at all, but pulling out and realizing that that is like a smaller version of a question that shaped a lot of world history, especially European history. It's just it feeling very important to be on one side of a line than another. And it's strange in some ways, because if you think it through, like, these lines are not natural. Like, if you Google for a map of the world, you will almost certainly be presented with a political map of the world. Yep. You will be shown a map showing 193, 194, I can never remember, all the countries.
There or thereabouts.
Yeah. But that's an assumption that is being made there, that what you are looking for are these kind of notional entities we call nation states, whereas actually a map of the world could be several other things. And just like that kind of realization that, like, these things are fake. We've made them up, but they do shape the whole of human history and politics, and everything going on in the world today is because of a set of lines that somebody at some point drew on a map that could have gone somewhere else. And it just kind of felt like a sort of interesting question to sort of explore where those lines come from and why it is we give them so much power.
Well, quite a lot of those lines were drawn, not that I'm blaming you personally, by your fellow Britons over the centuries, and you used a couple of minutes ago the phrase completely unresolvable, and I'm wondering with what levels of hesitancy or reluctance you addressed a couple of the more prominent lines that British people have drawn on maps, i.e. that one in Northern Ireland and those several in the Middle East.
So, yes, I did get a long way through the process. I sent in what I hoped was a complete draft, and my editor did have to gently point out that I was not going to get away without doing Ireland or Israel. I was going to have to do those chapters. So the Israel one in particular, like I basically begin it with a mea culpa in which I'm just like, I'm scared of writing this one. Because it is such it's a very difficult story. What I found writing it is like, following all the stuff that kind of leads to the creation of the State of Israel, it is almost impossible not to have enormous amounts of sympathy up till about 1973. And then it gets harder and harder to retain full sympathy with not the people of Israel, the government of Israel and the way it has behaved, but realizing like it's never really had proper borders, in the sense that we sort of understand them in Europe, in that for a long time, what is known as the Green Line was kind of the armistice line. It was just the line where the fighting happened to stop in, I think it was 1948. And it was just Israel's sort of borders with Egypt on one side and Transjordan as it was on the other. But these were kind of never sort of permanently intended to be the edge of the country. They were always provisional. And then later on, after the various conflicts of the late 60s, early 70s, Israel expands after being attacked by all of its neighbours at once, takes this land for originally it's going to be, so it has something in peace negotiations, but then the settlers start moving in and politicians win elections by talking about Greater Israel and so on. So then it's not the border in a different way because it's sort of inside the realm of Israeli political control. So it's never really had proper formalised borders, and that's obviously not the only reason for events in the Middle East right now, but it hasn't helped, has it?
But this is a recurring theme of the book, the way that an abstraction like a line drawn on a map does inevitably end up having a real-world effect, and it is a recurring theme of the book that borders, actually there probably are a few that literally are set in stone, but by and large they're not. And I'm just wondering, was there any particular, like, what if that especially enticed you, if a particular border had been drawn in one place and not another, how different the world might be now?
I mean, there are a couple. So, like, one, it wasn't really a single border, but I've always been very intrigued by the plan which the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was quite keen on for the United States of Greater Austria, which would have dealt with surging nationalism in the Habsburg realms by having a sort of much more federal, slightly devolved administration, which I'm not sure he just didn't like the Hungarians. He thought they had too much power. So I'm not sure how keen he was on this anyway, but we'll never know because, he was obviously shot and everything followed from that. But I've always found that
borders got very much redrawn as a consequence.
They did, but I've always found that quite intriguing, just this idea, like, what would the 20th century have been different if, like, one of Europe's biggest countries was kind of a very deliberately multinational, multicultural entity? And I don't think it's as simple as, like, if he hadn't been shot, we'd have ended up there. But I just think it's an interesting what-if of history.
In closing, your book is many things, but it's also a cue for one of those absolutely excellent local radio variety questions. John, what's your favourite border?
I really need to think of a better answer to this. It's about the 8th interview I've done. They still don't have it. Today, I'm going to say, I don't know if it's my favourite border, but it's my favourite story about a border in the book, is the Sudanese-Uganda Border Commission from 1913, in which two groups led by British officers on either side are sent out to draw a line on the map to divide two bits of the British Empire. And one of these guys wants to do a really good job. He wants to be very careful. He wants to do right by the locals. And the other guy is really tired and pissed off and wants to go home. So we have quite extensive diaries of the two of them gradually falling out. And the tired one does bugger off home. And then the other one, by this point, is just so exhausted he still ends up drawing a straight line for the last 400 miles because they're running out of water. He just wants to go. So like, even with the best will in the world, even with properly good intentions, he still ended up just drawing a straight line on the map of Africa. That is still there to this day.
Isn't that how we all feel sometimes? That was the author John Elledge speaking to Monocle's Andrew Muller about his new book, A History of the World in 47 Borders. And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panellists, Aliona Hlifko and Jacob Parakilis. Today's show was produced by Henry Rees-Sheridan, researched by Gunnar Grunlid, and our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Chris Chermak here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.